The frost came early that morning, silvering the tall grass and glazing the split-rail fence in a brittle shine. The mountain held its breath before sunrise, the sky a pale iron gray waiting for light. Smoke no longer rose from the cabin chimney. The fire inside had burned low hours ago. She stepped out quietly, closing the door behind her with careful hands, as though afraid even the hinges might protest. Her boots pressed shallow prints into the frozen earth. She carried a single carpet bag, smaller now than when she had arrived. The hem of her dress was damp with dew before she reached the yard. The mule was already saddled. He had tied the reins to the fence post the night before. The leather straps were checked, cinched, adjusted. A bedroll hung neat behind the saddle. A canteen rested where her hand would naturally fall. So no words needed. Everything prepared. She paused beside the animal and looked back at the cabin. In the thin light, it did not seem cruel. It stood solid against the slope, rough-hewn logs stacked with care, smoke-darkened roof pitched against winter. A place built to last. A place built by hands that knew endurance. Her face carried the wear of a single sleepless night. Not fear. Not anger. Something quieter. The slow realization that whatever she had hoped to find on this mountain did not belong to her. The door opened. He stepped out without a sound, tall against the paling sky. He did not come closer, did not ask her to stay. His arms folded once across his chest, then fell loose at his sides. His gaze rested on her the way a man watches weather rolling off a ridge, inevitable, unchallenged. For a long moment, neither moved. Then she mounted. The mule shifted, breath steaming in the cold. She gathered the reins, glanced once more toward the cabin, and turned down the narrow trail that cut through pine and stone. He remained where he was until horse and rider vanished beyond the bend. The sun finally crested the eastern ridge, laying thin gold across frost and timber. The yard stood empty again. The second set of footprints would fade before noon. Inside the cabin, the table held only one chair. By the time the valley woke, the mountain had already returned to what it knew best. Silence. And this was not the first dawn to end that way. By mid-morning, the frost had melted off the valley road, leaving the dirt dark and soft beneath wagon wheels. Silver Creek stirred to life the way it always did. Slow, practical, unromantic. The blacksmith's hammer rang against iron. A pair of boys chased each other past the hitching posts. The general store door creaked open and shut with steady rhythm. And somewhere between the smell of coffee and the scrape of chairs on wood, the mountain came down among them. She left before sunup, Hank Beaumont said, setting his tin cup on the store counter. His voice carried without effort. It always did. Didn't even wait for breakfast. A murmur rolled through the room. Mrs. Harper, who had once lost a husband to fever and a son to winter, shook her head slowly. That makes 8. 8 that we know of, someone corrected from near the flour barrels. Old Tom Granger leaned back in his chair, thumbs hooked into his suspenders. Man ought to stop sending for wives if he can't keep 'em. That ain't keepin', Mrs. Harper replied softly. That's something else. A younger man near the window spat into the dust outside. He's cursed, that's what he is. Came back from the war wrong. You can see it in his eyes. Ain't natural for a man to live up there alone like that. Or maybe, Anna Pierce said from behind the counter, measuring sugar into a paper sack. He just prefers quiet. A short laugh answered her. Quiet's one thing. Running women off before sunrise is another. Hank lifted his cup again, studying the rim before speaking. He don't run 'em off. The room shifted. No bride lasts the night, the younger man said, leaning forward as if stating a fact carved into stone. That's what folks say. And folks say a lot, Anna answered without looking up. Fear lived in the silence that followed. Not sharp fear. Not the kind that made men reach for rifles. a subtler thing, the kind that comes from not understanding a man who does not explain himself. There was pity there, too, for a soldier who returned to nothing, for a cabin built high and alone. Resentment threaded through it. Land he refused to sell, help he never asked for, eyes that never lowered when he passed through town. And beneath it all, suspicion. No one in Silver Creek could say exactly what happened on that mountain after dark. But the story had grown taller than the timber, and legends rarely need proof. By the time the sun cleared the ridge, the frost had retreated into shadowed places between stone and root. The mountain woke without hurry. Wind moved through the upper pines in a low, steady breath, and somewhere farther down the slope, a hawk cried once before falling silent. Inside the cabin, everything sat where it belonged. The table stood square in the center of the room. One chair faced the hearth. Its legs had been sanded smooth from use, the wood darkened by years of a single man's weight. Opposite it, nothing. No second place setting. No stool dragged near in hopeful anticipation. A single tin cup rested beside a folded cloth. When he finished his coffee, he rinsed it immediately and set it upside down to dry. There were no extra dishes soaking in the basin, no stray garments draped across the back of a chair. His tools lined the wall above the workbench, each hung on its peg with exact spacing. Hammer, draw knife, whetstone, oilcloth. The rifle above the door had been cleaned before dawn. The blade at his belt had already tasted the stone that morning, its edge brought back to a patient shine. He moved through these rituals without wasted motion. Chop wood, stack it evenly, check the fence line, mend a split board, each act deliberate, each task complete. He did not glance toward the trail, not once. Near midday, the mule's bridle creaked outside. Hooves struck the packed earth of the yard. He did not hurry to the door, but he did not delay either. Hank Beaumont stood at the fence, hat tipped back, eyes narrowed against the sun. "Got word from town," Hank said, swinging down slow. "Another letter came through. Woman answered it." Silence settled between them like dust. "She'll be here day after tomorrow, if the trail holds." The mountain man's gaze drifted briefly toward the empty stretch of path cutting through timber, then back to Hank. No question. No protest. Just a nod once, short and measured. Hank shifted his weight. "You want me to bring up anything special?" The man looked past him toward the stable where an extra saddle hung waiting. "No." Hank studied him a moment longer, as if searching for something human in the stillness. Whatever he sought did not show. The wind picked up, rattling the eaves. Inside, the single chair remained where it had always been. Ready. And never expecting to stay that way. The wagon rolled into Silver Creek beneath a sky washed pale with heat. Dust followed it like a patient shadow, settling over hitching posts and porch railings as the wheels creaked to a stop outside the general store. She stepped down without assistance. There was no trunk lashed to the back, no hat box, no bundles wrapped in quilts. Only a small leather satchel and a folded blanket tied tight with cord. She carried them herself, one in each hand, as though she had learned long ago to measure what she needed. Her dress was plain and practical, the hem stitched firm for travel. No lace, no bright ribbon. A narrow band held her hair back from her face. When she looked around, she did not appear overwhelmed or uncertain. She seemed to be taking stock. The town noticed. Mrs. Harper paused mid-sweep on the boardwalk. The blacksmith slowed his hammer stroke. Hank Beaumont leaned against the wagon wheel, watching her with the faintest crease between his brows. "You're here for the mountain?" Anna Pierce asked from the doorway, not unkindly. The woman nodded once. "I am." No tremor in her voice. A pair of young men near the trough exchanged glances. "She know what she's riding into?" one muttered, not low enough. "She'll know by morning," the other replied. Someone else said it clearer, and almost conversationally. as if passing on weather news. No bride lasts the night. The words carried across the warm air and settled near her boots. She did not turn toward the speaker. Instead, her gaze drifted to the northern ridge, where timber rose thick and dark against the horizon. She studied the line of it, the slope where rock cut through green, the narrow seam of trail barely visible from town. Her eyes traced the incline the way a surveyor might, measuring distance rather than danger. When Hank stepped closer, she handed him the satchel without comment and climbed back into the wagon. "You heard what folks said," he offered as the reins tightened in his hands. "Yes," she replied. "And that don't trouble you?" She considered the ridge once more before answering. "No." The wagon turned north, on wheels catching in ruts before finding the open stretch toward the mountain. Town voices resumed behind her, softer now, but not gone. She did not look back. The higher they climbed, the quieter it became. The air thinned. Pine replaced dust. She breathed it in as though arriving somewhere familiar. And the mountain, watching from above, gave nothing away. The cabin stood where timber thinned and rock began, built into the slope as though the mountain had permitted it rather than surrendered to it. Smoke drifted from the chimney in a straight gray line. The yard was swept clean. No clutter. No wasted tools. He was waiting. Not at the door, but a few paces from it, near the split rail fence. Hatless. Arms loose at his sides. His presence was not aggressive nor welcoming. It was simply there, solid and immovable as the ridge behind him. Hank slowed the wagon. "She made it," he said unnecessarily. The mountain man's gaze shifted to her. She climbed down without hesitation. The leather satchel hung from her shoulder. The blanket remained tied. She looked first at the cabin, then at the fence posts, then at the stacked woodpile aligned so precisely it might have been measured with a string. "You built it yourself?" she asked. "Yes." Her eyes moved to the stable, the water trough, the narrow path cut toward the spring. She noticed the extra saddle hanging ready inside the stable door. "You keep things in order," she said. "I do." Hank cleared his throat, sensing the edges of something neither sharp nor soft. "I'll be back down by sundown," he offered, then thought better of it. "Or dawn, if needed." The mountain man nodded once. Hank left. Silence settled in his wake. The woman stepped forward into the yard, boots pressing into packed earth. She stopped a few feet from him, close enough for conversation, not close enough for familiarity. "What are the arrangements?" she asked. His expression did not shift. "Water's drawn from the spring east of the ridge. Woods cut and stacked. Suppers at sundown. I hunt. I mend. You keep the house as you see fit." She considered this. "And the rest?" "There is no rest." A faint breeze moved through the pine behind them. "You'll have the bed," he continued. "I keep the chair." Her gaze flicked toward the open doorway, where the single chair stood visible at the table. "And if I don't suit the mountain?" she asked. His eyes held hers steadily. "If you want to leave at dawn, the mule will be ready." No challenge in his tone, no invitation either. She studied him for a moment longer than politeness required, not searching for warmth, not testing for cruelty, simply measuring. "Then I'll rise early," she said at last, "one way or the other." He stepped aside and gestured toward the door. She entered first. Behind her, the wind shifted direction, and the mountain listened. The door closed behind her with a low wooden thud, sealing out the wind and the slope beyond. Inside, the cabin held the quiet of a place long accustomed to a single breath. The room was spare without being neglected. A stone hearth claimed one wall, its mantel bare except for a small tin lantern and a folded cloth. The fire within burned steady but not generous, casting thin amber light that reached only so far before surrendering to shadow. The corners of the cabin lived in dusk, even before sunset. A wooden table stood near the center of the room. Solid, square, scarred by years of knives and tools. One chair rested at its head, angled slightly toward the hearth, as though habit had worn it there. Opposite it, empty space stretched like an unspoken rule. Against the far wall sat a narrow bed, its frame built plain and practical, the blanket folded tight at its foot. No extra pillows, no decoration. A man's place. Not unclean, not unkind, simply stripped of anything unnecessary. She set her satchel near the door and walked the length of the room slowly, fingertips brushing the grain of the table, the cool stone of the hearth, the smooth wood of the chair back. She took in the careful placement of tools along the wall, the rifle mounted above the door, the boots lined heel to heel beside the bed. Everything had a position. Oh, everything had a purpose. A small, three-legged stool rested near the workbench in the corner, not for comfort, for utility. She picked it up. The scrape of wood against floorboards carried softly as she moved it toward the table. She placed it opposite the lone chair, not directly across, but angled slightly inward, as if it had always meant to belong there. The adjustment was minor, barely noticeable. He noticed. From the doorway, where he had remained standing since she entered, his gaze shifted to the stool and then to her hands, still resting on its seat. She did not look up at him. "There's room for two at a table," she said quietly. The fire snapped once, a small pop of sap in the wood. He stepped further inside, removed his hat, and set it on the peg by the door. The shadows shifted across the wall as the flames leaned and settled. Well, he did not move the stool back. But neither did he sit. The cabin, accustomed to its balance, seemed to pause, testing whether it would hold. Supper was simple. Beans warmed in a cast-iron pot. A heel of bread split clean with a knife that had been sharpened that morning. He set the tin plates down without ceremony. She brought the pot from the hearth and divided it evenly between them, as if that had always been the arrangement. He took the chair. She sat on the stool. For a while, there was only the sound of spoons against metal and the low murmur of the fire settling deeper into its bed of coals. The mountain wind pressed once against the cabin wall and moved on. She did not rush the quiet. When she spoke, her tone was measured, neither accusing nor curious for sport. "What happened to the others?" He did not look up immediately. He chewed once more, swallowed, then set his spoon down beside his plate. "They left." "I gathered that." His eyes lifted then, steady but unreadable. "One feared the mountain," he said. She waited. "The wind don't rest up here. Timber groans at night. Rocks shift in cold. Some folks mistake that for warning." "And the second?" "Feared the silence." The fire snapped softly between them. "Silence from you?" she asked. "Silence in general?" She turned that over in her mind, as if weighing it for sense. "And the third?" A longer pause this time. "She feared me." There was no bitterness in the words, no defense, only fact. She studied his face as though trying to see what that bride might have seen. The scar near his jaw caught firelight. His shoulders remained squared, posture straight, hands steady on the table. "But you give them reason?" she asked. "I don't give them much of anything." A corner of her mouth almost shifted, not amusement, not judgment, something closer to recognition. "Fear fills empty spaces," she said quietly. He regarded her a moment, then reached for his cup. "And you?" he asked, not sharply. She broke a piece of bread and dipped it into the beans before answering. "I prefer knowing what I'm afraid of." Outside, the wind pressed harder against the cabin wall. Neither of them looked toward the door. The fire had burned low by the time the dishes were rinsed and set to dry. Night settled over the mountain without spectacle. No lamps in neighboring windows. No distant wagon wheels. Only the steady breathing of timber and wind beyond the walls. He added one split log to the hearth and stood watching until the flame caught. She had taken the blanket from her satchel and folded it neatly at the foot of the narrow bed, not claiming it, not hesitating either, simply preparing. The cabin felt smaller in the dark. He remained by the fire a long moment before speaking. "At dawn," he said evenly, "you may leave." The words carried no strain, no expectation. She turned slightly, though she did not face him fully. "The mule will be saddled," he continued. "Trails clearer in morning light. Less wind along the lower ridge." He spoke as a man reciting instructions long memorized, the phrasing precise, the order practiced. "I will not stop you." The fire shifted, casting his shadow tall across the wall. She studied the outline of him there, the broad shoulders, the stillness of his stance. "Is that how it's done?" she asked. "God, yes." "You prepare the mule." "Yes." "And they go." He nodded once. "And you?" "I remain." Silence stretched between them, not hostile, but heavy with something unspoken. The ritual had been offered, the choice laid out plainly. No persuasion, no plea. She stepped closer to the hearth, extending her hands toward the warmth. The light traced the calm line of her face. "And if I choose otherwise?" she asked quietly. He did not hesitate. "That would be your choosing." She met his eyes then, steady as the flame itself, searching perhaps for doubt, or for invitation. She found neither. After a moment, she turned back toward the bed. "I suppose morning will tell," she said. He inclined his head once, accepting the answer without comment. Outside, the wind shifted direction again, brushing pine needles in a low, restless sweep. He did not sit in the chair. She did not lie down. The fire burned between them, patient and watchful, and the mountain waited for dawn. The night did not fall all at once. It gathered. Wind moved first, sliding through the upper timber with a low, hollow murmur that rose and fell like distant surf. Pine needles brushed against one another in restless conversation. Somewhere higher along the ridge, a loose branch knocked in uneven rhythm against bark. Inside the cabin, the fire settled into coals. She lay on the narrow bed, blanket pulled to her shoulders, eyes open to the ceiling beams. The wood above her bore the marks of a careful hand. Each plank fitted tight, each nail driven true. The room smelled faintly of smoke and pine resin, not unpleasant, not welcoming either. The cabin shifted as night deepened, saw a soft pop in the wall where sap warmed and released, the faintest groan as the temperature dropped and timber tightened against its joints. The sound might have unsettled someone unfamiliar with mountain houses. She did not startle. Outside, an owl called once, sharp and sudden. The cry echoed off rock and faded into the trees. Later came the distant yip of a fox or coyote, thin and fleeting. Hooves did not pound. No footsteps approached the door. Only the ordinary pulse of wilderness, unadorned and unthreatening to those who understood it. In the chair by the hearth, he sat motionless. The firelight traced the edge of his jaw, caught the faint scar near his temple. One elbow rested on the arm of the chair. His fingers touched his chin, not in thought so much as in habit. His boots remained planted square on the floorboards, when he did not watch her, at least, not directly. When the wind pressed harder against the cabin wall, he rose and adjusted the latch, checking its hold, though it had never failed before. He added a small log to the coals, not enough to brighten the room, only to ensure warmth until dawn. "You can sleep," she said quietly into the dim. "I do," he answered. but his eyes remained open long after the fire thinned to embers. Time passed without measure. The moon climbed, unseen beyond the roofline. Shadows shifted across the walls, stretching and shrinking with the glow of coals. She turned once beneath the blanket, not restless, only adjusting. He listened to the cadence of her breathing, steady, untroubled. Near the darkest hour before morning, the wind softened. The mountain grew still. He did not move from the chair, and when his eyes finally closed, it was only for a moment, just long enough to admit the night had not broken her. Dawn came pale and deliberate, sliding through the narrow cabin window in thin gray bands. The fire had long since faded to ash. The air carried the sharpness of early mountain cold. He was already awake. He rose from the chair without stretching, without hesitation, and stepped outside before the first true light crested the ridge. Frost had returned during the night, settling quiet and thin across the yard. His boots left dark impressions as he crossed to the stable. The mule stood waiting. He checked the straps with practiced hands, tightening where needed, adjusting the bedroll, securing the canteen at the saddle's flank. The routine required no thought. It had been performed before. Each buckle fastened with the same calm finality. He did not look toward the cabin. The door opened softly behind him. He kept his gaze on the mule's reins as he looped them over the fence post. The wind carried the faint rustle of fabric as she stepped into the yard. He heard her boots press into frost-hardened earth, heard her pause. He did not turn. For a long moment, there was only the sound of morning birds beginning their careful calls. He reached once more for the saddle strap, though it did not need adjusting. Footsteps moved past him, not toward the mule, toward the east ridge. He remained still, jaw set, eyes fixed on leather and wood. A bucket lifted from beside the cabin wall. The metal handle scraped softly against stone. The sound carried down the narrow path leading to the spring. He did not follow. He listened. The wind shifted. Somewhere beyond the trees, water moved against rock. The steady dip and rise of a bucket breaking the surface. When she returned, she did not look at him. She carried the filled bucket carefully, water sloshing only slightly as she crossed the yard. She set it beside the door, wiped her hands on her skirt, and moved toward the woodpile. An axe lay embedded in the chopping block. She grasped the handle, tested its weight, brought it down clean and sure against the first split log. The crack of wood echoed sharp against the quiet slope. He turned then. Not quickly, not startled, just enough to see her stance, balanced, steady, unafraid of the swing. Another strike, another clean split. The mule waited, reins slack against the fence. The sun crested the ridge at last, laying thin gold across frost and timber. He did not speak. He stepped forward and untied the mule, led it back toward the stable. And for the first time in many dawns, he did not feel relief. Something else, quieter and unfamiliar, began to take its place. The stakes appeared 3 days after she chose to stay. He saw the smoke first, not the steady column from his own chimney, but a thinner thread rising lower along the southern slope, where no cabin stood. By midday, the sound followed. Metal striking stone, a distant hammering that did not belong to wind or wood. She heard it too. They stood side by side near the fence, neither acknowledging the other's presence, both listening. "That isn't weather," she said quietly. "No." By afternoon, the men were visible through the timber. 3 of them, coats marked with dust, hats pulled low, rifles slung carelessly at their backs. One carried a measuring chain. Another drove a wooden stake into the earth with sharp, decisive blows. A 4th man lingered behind them, mounted, posture easy in the saddle. Even at a distance, his coat was cut finer than the others. The mountain man's jaw tightened once. "Railroad," he said. She glanced at him. "You were expecting them." "They've been talking about pushing a line through the valley. Easier grade up this side." "And this land?" "Mine." He did not raise his voice, did not move toward his rifle. Instead, he stepped forward down the slope at an unhurried pace, boots steady on uneven ground. She followed a few steps behind before stopping. He did not ask her to. The mounted man turned first as the mountain man approached. His smile held no warmth. "Afternoon," the rider called. "We're marking a potential route. A company's expanding north." "You're on private land." The rider tilted his head slightly. "Land can change hands." "Not this one." A stake struck earth again behind them. The sharp crack carried across the slope. The rider studied him, eyes narrowing just enough to suggest calculation. "Company's prepared to offer compensation," he said. "Generous. I'm not selling." The wind lifted the rider's coat hem, revealing polished boots unsuited for steep ground. "Everyone sells," he replied mildly. The mountain man did not look back toward the cabin, did not glance toward the woman watching from higher ground. "This isn't everyone." The rider's smile faded, though not entirely. "We'll be back." The men gathered their tools, leaving the stake buried where it had been driven. He remained standing beside it long after they descended. He would handle this, as he handled all things. Alone. Or so he intended. He pulled the surveyor's stake from the ground with a single hard motion and carried it back toward the cabin. He did not splinter it, did not toss it aside. He laid it flat against the fence, as though it were nothing more than misplaced kindling. She was waiting near the woodpile. "You won't sell," she said. "No. And they won't stop." "They'll learn." She studied him in the quiet that followed. The wind pressed at the eaves. The mule shifted inside the stable. "You plan to face them alone." "I faced worse." He moved past her toward the shed, reaching for a coil of rope that did not need coiling. His hands found work the way other men found comfort. She did not follow immediately. Instead, she watched him move through the yard with controlled precision, checking the fence line, adjusting a hinge, lifting a bucket that was already full. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked. "There's nothing to tell." "They're marking your land." "I saw." "That wasn't my question." He paused then, rope still in his hands. She stepped closer, not invading, only narrowing the distance between them. "You prepare for people to leave," she said, her voice even. "You prepare the mule before they ask. You prepare the chair to stay empty." His shoulders stiffened almost imperceptibly. "You push people away before they can leave." He turned to face her fully now. The space between them held more than air. "That's not what happens," he said. "No? They decide. And you make it easy." A muscle in his jaw tightened. "I don't beg." "I didn't say you should." Silence pressed between them harder than the wind. He looked past her toward the tree line, toward the ridge where the surveyors had stood. "Up here," he said slowly, "a person learns not to depend on what won't stay. And you assume nothing will." "I assume what history's shown me." She did not raise her voice, did not soften it either. "History doesn't know me." His gaze returned to her, sharp now, not angry, but unsettled. "You've been here 3 days, and I'm still here." The words hung between them like a challenge neither had spoken aloud. He broke eye contact first, turning back toward the shed. "You don't know this mountain," he said. She answered without hesitation. "Perhaps." The wind moved through the pines again, lower this time. But I know the difference between solitude and exile." The storm rolled in without warning. Clouds gathered over the ridge just before dusk, heavy and fast-moving, swallowing the last of the light. By the time the first thunder reached them, the sky had already darkened to slate. They secured the shutters together without discussion. He checked the stable. She brought in the laundry before the rain struck in hard, slanting sheets. Inside, the cabin dimmed to firelight once more. He stood near the hearth, coat damp at the shoulders. She wrung rainwater from her sleeves into the basin, movement steady. Thunder cracked closer this time. The cabin walls trembled faintly. "You've faced worse," she said quietly, not looking at him. He did not answer at once. The rain intensified, hammering against the roof. "So war doesn't ask permission," he said finally. She turned. He remained standing, gaze fixed on the flames. "It takes men who think they're ready," he continued, "leaves the ones who weren't." A pause. "I led 6 through a narrow pass once. Snow came early. We didn't." The fire shifted, sending sparks upward. "I misjudged the ridge," he added. "Lost 2 before nightfall." He did not elaborate. She waited. "One of them was my brother." The words fell plainly, no emphasis. Thunder rolled again across the valley. "And the others?" she asked. "They followed." He lifted a hand to his jaw, brushing the scar there as though it itched. "Came home with 3 names carved into wood instead of 6. Rain slid in cold streams down the cabin window. "After that," he said, folks looked at me different. Like the mountain looked at you." He gave the faintest shake of his head. "Like I'd brought something back with me." The storm pressed hard against the walls. "There was a woman," he added, almost as an afterthought. "Promised she'd wait." He did not smile. She didn't. Silence followed. Not brittle, not fragile, just present. She stepped closer to the hearth, letting the warmth reach her hands. "You think staying is a promise," she said softly, "and promises break." He did not look at her. "I think," he replied, voice level, "that leaving hurts less when you expect it." The thunder moved farther down the ridge. The rain eased. He did not say more, and she did not ask. The storm passed before dawn, leaving the mountain washed clean and unsettled. Branches lay scattered across the slope, and runoff carved fresh lines through the dirt path leading east. He stepped outside early to check the fence. She followed without being asked. Halfway down the ridge, they heard it. A sharp, panicked cry cutting through the thinning mist. Not human. He moved first, instinct tightening his posture. She was only a stride behind. Beyond the lower fence line, near the narrow cut where deer often crossed, a yearling colt lay tangled in broken wire. The storm had torn part of the fence loose, and the animal had panicked, thrashing itself deeper into the snare. Its flank was slick with mud and streaked with blood where metal had bitten skin. Its eyes rolled white with fear. He crouched slowly, hands open. "Easy," he murmured, voice low and steady. The colt jerked against the wire again. She moved to the opposite side without instruction, for kneeling in the wet grass. Her movements were measured, not rushed. "Hold the head," he said. She did. Firm but gentle, fingers sliding along the trembling neck until the animal's breathing slowed by a fraction. He reached for his knife. The wire was twisted tight. He cut once, twice, careful not to nick the flesh beneath. The colt kicked, hooves striking mud inches from his shoulder. She did not release her grip. "Steady," she whispered, not to him, but to the animal. Another length of wire gave way, then another. The final strand snapped free. For a heartbeat, the colt remained still, stunned by sudden release. Then it scrambled to its feet and bolted toward open ground, limping but upright. They remained kneeling in the mud, breathing hard. He wiped his blade clean against his sleeve and sheathed it without speaking. She rose first, unbrushing wet grass from her skirt. There was blood on her cuff, not her own, he noticed. "You should wash that," he said. "I will." He studied the broken fence line, then glanced at her. "You didn't hesitate." She met his gaze evenly. Neither did you. The wind moved lightly through the trees now, gentler than before. He began gathering the torn wire. She reached for the loose boards. No instruction passed between them. None was needed. And somewhere between mud and morning light, something unspoken shifted, no longer testing, beginning to trust. They worked until the fence stood straight again. By late afternoon, the mountain had settled into a deceptive calm. The storm's damage mended where it could be, the rest waiting for stronger hands or better weather. He drove the final nail into the post and stepped back to test its hold. It held. She wiped her palms against her skirt, streaking it darker with earth. A thin cut marked her knuckle where the wire had slipped. She did not seem to notice. He did. "They'll come back," he said, eyes on the valley below rather than on her. "The railroad men. I know. And if they don't persuade, they'll pressure." She nodded once. Silence lingered, not strained, waited. He removed his gloves slowly, folding them together in his hands. For a moment he seemed to consider something, jaw tightening, then easing. "You could still leave," he said. The words were different now. Not ritual. Not habit. A gust of wind lifted loose strands of her hair across her cheek. She did not brush them away. "Because of them?" she asked. "Because of me." He kept his gaze fixed on the distant slope where the surveyors had stood days earlier. "I don't bend easy," he continued, "and I don't break quiet. Folks who stay near me end up fighting battles they didn't ask for." He almost said more. The pause stretched thin. He almost told her the mountain had already taken enough from him. Almost told her that he would rather lose land than risk losing another person by keeping her too close. But he stopped. The words remained unspoken. "If you stay," he said instead, voice level but lower than before, "it won't be easy." She regarded him steadily, not defiant, not tender. "I didn't come for easy." The answer settled between them like a stake driven firm into ground. For the first time since her arrival, something in his posture shifted. Not guarded, not braced for departure. Simply open by a fraction. The light had begun to soften, turning the ridge gold at its edges. The repaired fence stood solid behind them. He reached out, not to pull her closer, not to claim, but to brush his thumb lightly over the cut on her knuckle. "You'll want to clean that," he said quietly. She did not step back. "I will." His hand lingered a heartbeat longer than necessary before falling away. The wind moved gently now, no longer testing the walls. And when they walked back toward the cabin, they did so side by side, no longer measuring distance, only the ground ahead. They returned 3 days later. No storm this time, no pretense of surveying. The same mounted man led them, coat brushed clean, boots polished despite the incline. 2 laborers followed on foot, carrying tools not for measuring but for removing. The stake had been replaced. This time it stood closer to the cabin. He saw it from the porch before they reached the fence line. She saw his jaw set. "You don't have to stand out here," he said quietly, not looking at her. "I know." They walked down the slope together. The mounted man tipped his hat slightly as they approached. His smile remained practiced. "Afternoon," he said. "Company's made its decision. Rail lines coming through this side of the ridge. We're prepared to compensate." He did not acknowledge her presence. The mountain man stopped a few paces from the new stake. "I told you," he said evenly. "I'm not selling." The rider shifted in his saddle. "This isn't about preference. It's about progress." One of the laborers stepped forward and drove the stake deeper with a hard strike. The sound echoed across the slope. She moved then, not forward in challenge, but beside him, and close enough that their shoulders nearly aligned. The rider noticed her for the first time. "And you are?" he asked. "Staying," she replied simply. The rider's gaze flicked between them. This line will bring trade, jobs, growth. It'll bring noise, the mountain man answered, and strangers who won't leave. The rider's patience thinned. Company holds rights to adjacent parcels. You're boxed in. Not boxed, she said calmly. Bordered. The laborers hesitated, glancing toward the rider. He studied the two of them now, no longer one solitary figure against the slope, but two standing firm in the same patch of ground. Compensation stands, he said at last, but construction moves forward. It doesn't, the mountain man replied. A silence stretched long enough for wind to move through pine. No one reached for a weapon. No voice rose. Finally, the rider exhaled sharply through his nose. You'll regret stubbornness. Perhaps, she said quietly. The rider turned his horse without another word. The laborers followed. The stake remained. He stepped forward and pulled it free once more. This time, when he laid it down, he did not do so alone. She placed her boot over it, steady and sure. The mountain did not roar in victory. It simply held its ground. He rode into Silver Creek at midday, not out of habit, but necessity. Fence wire had to be replaced, and salt for the mule was running low. She rode beside him on the borrowed mare Hank had offered without comment. The town noticed that first. 2 horses instead of 1. They tied off at the hitching post outside the general store. No one stopped hammering. No one froze mid-step, but eyes followed them more openly than before. Anna Pierce was measuring flour when they entered. She glanced up and offered a nod, small, unforced. You're holding, she said. For now, he answered. No edge in his voice, no guardedness either. Hank stepped out from behind a stack of feed sacks. Heard about the railroad men, he said. Company's been asking around. They'll keep asking, the mountain man replied. And you'll keep refusing, Hank said, not as accusation but recognition. A faint curve touched Hank's mouth before he turned to her. You need anything particular? Salt, she answered, and more lamp oil. Hank gathered the items without further question. Near the stove, old Tom Granger cleared his throat. Line won't run easy through that ridge, he muttered. Ground's harder than it looks. The mountain man inclined his head once. It was the closest thing to agreement they had ever shared. Outside, a pair of boys paused near the hitching rail. Is that him? One whispered. The other shrugged. Looks like any other man. The words carried lightly on the air. He stepped back into the sunlight, with the sack of supplies slung over his shoulder. She followed, carrying the oil carefully wrapped. No one muttered about curses. No one spoke of brides leaving. Mrs. Harper passed them on the boardwalk and gave her a brief, assessing look, not pitying, not warning. You've chosen high ground, she said. Yes, she replied. Mrs. Harper nodded once. High ground keeps what it wants. They mounted without spectacle. As they rode north again, conversation in town resumed at its usual volume. No legend trailed them. No shadow stretched longer than the afternoon sun. Just a man returning to his land, and a woman riding beside him. The mountain waited as it always had, but something had shifted below it. Not fear. Recognition. Evening settled softly over the ridge. The work was finished for the day. Wire restrung. Tools returned to their places. The mule fed and brushed down. Smoke rose in a thin, patient column from the chimney as the sky shifted from gold to blue. They sat on the low stretch of earth just beyond the porch rather than inside. The ground still held a trace of warmth from the sun. Crickets had begun their steady rhythm in the grass below. He rested his forearms on his knees, hands clasped loosely. She sat beside him, close but not touching, skirt spread carefully over the dirt. For a while, they watched the last light slide along the upper ridge. "I expected you to leave," he said at last. The words came without weight. Not apology, not accusation. She did not look at him immediately. "I know," she replied. He drew in a slow breath. "I prepared for it." "The mule," she said quietly. "The chair." A faint line creased his brow. "I thought it would be easier that way." For whom? He considered that. For both. The wind moved gently across the slope, stirring loose grass and carrying the scent of pine. She traced a small circle in the dirt with her fingertip before answering. "I considered it," she said. His gaze shifted toward her then, not sharply, but fully. "The first night," she continued, "the silence felt larger than I expected." He nodded once, as if that confirmed something long assumed. "And the second morning?" he asked. She allowed the smallest hint of a smile. "You looked relieved when I stepped outside." "I was. Not because you wanted me gone. No." They sat with that. "I thought," she added carefully, "that if I left before I mattered, it would cost less." He understood that. "Does it?" he asked. She met his eyes now. "Yes." The honesty between them did not flare or swell. It settled, steady and unguarded. He shifted slightly closer, not enough to close the space entirely, but enough to narrow it. "I don't know how to keep people," he said. "I didn't ask you to," she answered. The sky dimmed further. The first star appeared over the far ridge. They remained there until the light faded completely. Not holding hands, not making promises. Just sharing the same ground, without bracing for departure. He began before sunrise, not because it was urgent, not because the fence had failed or the railroad had returned. The mountain stood quiet, the valley below untouched by smoke or survey lines. He worked because something in him had shifted from holding ground to shaping it. She woke to the sound of sawing. The rhythm was steady, deliberate, wood drawn clean beneath blade, not hurried, not forced. She stepped outside with her shawl wrapped loosely around her shoulders and found him near the workbench, boards laid out in measured rows. Not rough timber, planed. He had chosen the straighter grain from the stack set aside for later. She did not interrupt. He marked each board carefully, cut them to equal length, then began fitting the legs. The shape took form slowly, familiar but distinct from the one inside. Another chair. Not a stool pulled in from a corner. Not temporary. A chair built with weight in mind. He sanded the edges smooth where hands would rest. Tested the balance before setting it upright. When it stood level against the earth, he did not adjust it further. She stepped closer then, brushing wood shavings from her skirt. "For the table," she said. He nodded once. Inside, he moved the original chair back slightly, no longer at the head, but to the side. He placed the new one opposite it, angled evenly, neither claiming more space than the other. The room altered in quiet ways. The table no longer faced a single direction. That afternoon, he widened the porch by a narrow span, adding 2 planks along the front edge. Not enough to boast of expansion. Just enough for 2 people to sit without shifting for space. By evening, when he broke ground beside the eastern wall, the soil was stubborn near the surface, softened only inches down. He worked it loose with steady pressure, clearing stones, shaping rows by hand. She brought water from the spring without being asked. "What will you plant?" she said. "Something that roots," he answered. The first seeds went into earth before nightfall. He pressed soil over them carefully, not too deep. When they stepped back to look at it, the patch of turned ground appeared small against the sweep of the mountain. But it was no longer land waiting for departure. It was land expecting growth. Inside, 2 chairs waited at the table, neither empty, neither temporary. Sunrise returned without frost. Light moved gently across the ridge, slipping between pine branches before settling against the cabin walls, so that the air carried the cool promise of morning, but not the sharp edge it once had. Smoke rose from the chimney in a slow, steady ribbon, pale against the widening sky. Inside, the fire had already been stirred. 2 cups rested on the table, not placed in ceremony, not aligned with precision, simply used. One bore the faint mark of her thumb near the rim. The other sat closer to the chair he had occupied for years, now turned slightly toward its companion rather than away. The new chair did not look new anymore. A thin scrape along one leg suggested it had already been shifted more than once. The wood carried the faint polish of a hand, brushing its back in passing. Outside, the garden patch held small signs of green breaking through soil. Nothing dramatic, just proof of patience. Now he stepped onto the widened porch and leaned against the post he had set himself. The valley below lay quiet, Silver Creek still waking to its own rhythm. No riders approached. No stakes marked fresh ground. Behind him, she moved about the cabin with the unhurried certainty of someone who did not measure her stay by sunrise. He heard the soft clink of tin against wood. She joined him on the porch, handing him his cup without ceremony. They stood side by side, as light stretched across the slope, touching fence lines, stable roof, and the young rows of earth beside the wall. Wind moved gently through the trees, no longer sounding like warning. For a long time, they said nothing. There were no promises exchanged, no declarations carved into timber, only 2 figures on high ground, watching a day begin without bracing for its end. The mountain had witnessed many dawns before this one, many departures, many silent trails leading downward before light fully formed. No bride had lasted a night, but she stayed, and for the first time in years, the mountain no longer felt empty.